So, welcome everybody to Euro 30 as the common currency finally grown up. My name is Angelo Martelli and I'm an assistant professor in European International Political Economy at the European Institute. This event not only marks almost 30 years since the Maastricht Treaty laid the foundations for the European Union as we know it today, but on a smaller scale and closer to us, we also celebrate the 30th anniversary of the LSE European Institute, 30 years which have turned our department into a leading center at the forefront of study and research on Europe in the UK and for Europe in the world. The exceptional panel this afternoon is the first in a program of exciting anniversary events taking place over the next weeks and months, for which you can find more information on our webpage. For those Twitter users in the audience, the hashtag for today's event is LSEEI30. And the podcast will be made available. Hopefully there will be no technical difficulties or outages as we have experienced in the last week, and will be made available shortly after this event. The Maastricht Treaty significantly increased cooperation between European countries in a number of new areas, from freedom of movement with a European citizenship to common foreign and security policy to justice and home affairs, but it also paved the way for the creation of a single currency, the euro. Indeed, the treaty envisioned a three-stage transition process culminating in 1999 with the gradual introduction of the euro, together with the implementation of a single monetary policy for which the ECB is responsible, with the main objective to maintain price stability and safeguard the value of the euro. Since then, and as the former ECB president Draghi remembered a couple of years ago, actually on the 20th anniversary of the launch of the euro, we have had 2 decades which were rather exceptional. The first was the culmination of a 30-year upswing in the global financial cycle, while the second saw the worst and economic and financial crisis since the 1930s. And looking at the past 2 years, I would add with certainly even more unique events happening since then. Draghi in his speech continued by saying that the monetary union has succeeded in many ways, but it has not delivered the gains that were expected in all countries. This is partly the result of domestic policy choices and partly the result of monetary union being incomplete, which led to insufficient stabilization during the crisis. So the way ahead is to identify the changes that are necessary to make our monetary union work for the benefit of all member countries. So to discuss the fate of the common currency, I am joined today by 3 eminent experts that I have the pleasure and honor to introduce. I'll introduce them in order of the introductory remarks that they will give. First one is Waltraud Schelkle. She's a professor in political economy at the European Institute and has been at the LSE since 2001. She's also an adjunct professor of economics at the economics department for the Free University of Berlin. Paul de Grauwe is the John Paulson Chair in European Political Economy at the LSE European Institute. Prior to joining the LSE, he was professor of international economics at the University of Leuven in Belgium. He was also a member of the Belgian Parliament from 1991 to 2003. And then we have Martin Wolf. He's the chief economics commentator at the Financial Times. He was awarded CB in 2000 for services to financial journalism. And he was also a member of the UK government's Independent Commission on Banking between June 2010 and September 2010. So the way we will proceed is the following. We will have first a round of brief introductory remarks by our distinguished speakers in answering the question which gives the title to the event, and we will then focus on more specific issues. Let me remind you that you will have ample time for your questions. So start using the Q&A function, add your affiliation and to whom the question is directed, or if it is to the entire panel. So without further ado, let me turn to our panel and starting with Professor Schelkle. So Waltraud, has the common currency finally grown up?
I think it has. And it is exactly that the common currency, or rather its users, have grown up at 30. Well, I think at 20 it had not. They were fighting like some rowdy juveniles at the pub on Friday night. At 30, I think we can see that a system of reinsurance has emerged that is an alternative to a system of co-insurance. Co-insurance of state and federal schemes is typical for a federal state. Reinsurance is insurance or a backstop for insurers themselves, by which they typically cover tail risks, the possibility of very high losses that could wreck them. For example, health insurers, private health insurance often takes reinsurance in case medical progress forces them to cover very costly new treatments through their contracts. And then they need to be reinsured because otherwise they could go bust. The insurers in the context that we are talking about now is the welfare states of member states, and the euro area institutions reinsure them. But it started before the pandemic. In the banking crisis since 2008, member states were first of all reinsured by the extraordinary interventions of the ECB as a lender of last resort. And contrary to what is often said, this helped not only the banks, although it helped them very much, but also the savers who had deposits in these banks, as well as the pension funds and life insurers with which households held policies. But this ECB lending could not help with pervasive solvency problems once the dust settled a bit from the immediate crisis. So a bailout fund for sovereign debt, the European Stability Mechanism, ESM, and a single resolution fund for banks have been introduced. This single resolution fund is way too small, and therefore it is ultimately paid by the financial industry itself, and will get the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, as a backstop from next year onward. So you see that the reinsurer gets a reinsurance, which is not unknown in private insurance as well. And finally, then during the pandemic last year, I think the EU introduced a reinsurance scheme for job retention schemes, SURE it's called, and the recovery primarily for member states that were very hard hit and or poor to begin with. It is in the interest of all members that the recovery, that is what the reinsurance payout makes more likely. This system in which the parts complement each other was not designed by any identifiable collective of EU decision makers. It's the outcome of piecemeal reforms under the pressure of an escalating crisis and the attempt to keep contingent liabilities invisible. Political economists should not be surprised by that. The US made its biggest advance in terms of financial monetary integration after devastating civil war in the second half of the 19th century. So, and here is my provocation for my co-panelists. I think a system of reinsurance makes perfect sense and is actually the more promising alternative to a centralized budget, given the state of Europe's political integration, the diversity of tax transfer states in the euro area, and the dismal experience with fiscal federalism all over the world, in particular in the next comparator, the United States. The EU as an experimental union resembles a human being who grows up, exposed to many influences that do not follow a coherent plan. But in the end, voila, at some point, we find a recognizable individual that has a character and personality. And that's how I see the experimental monetary union at 30. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Waltraud, for these very interesting at the same time provocative for the others thoughts that you have shared with us. Let me then turn to Paul to see if he responds to these criticisms and provocative thoughts and what he has to say about them. Paul, you're muted. No problem.
Okay. So thank you, Angelo. You asked the question, has the euro finally grown up? So I answer like Waltraud, yes, it has grown up, but it is still far away from a healthy adult capable of withstanding all future shocks, in particular the climate change, to which I will return later, right? So to start out, let me say the following. The euro, in a way, was born with a birth defect, right? Kind of weak immune system. We now know what that means, right? which I have been called the fragility of the system, which has arisen when governments that used to be standalone prior to join the monetary union now found themselves in a monetary union, issuing bonds in a currency over which they had no control. And as a result, they could not guarantee to bondholders that these would always be repaid at maturity. And this created a potential for self-fulfilling crisis, liquidity crisis that could ultimately push these governments into default and also into a bad equilibrium where they are forced to do austerity, all things that we think governments should not do, because especially these crises arise during recessions, right? And this certainly contrasts with the situation they had before when they were standalone and could therefore give a guarantee that bonds will always be repaid in the domestic currency. So the essence of the problem was, in fact, that national governments that used to be sovereign lost a significant dimension of sovereignty, which had the effect that these sovereigns or governments could be brought down by financial markets, right? It could be forced into default. Quite an extraordinary change in the balance of power if you think that we tend to believe that when you are in a union, you are stronger. No, by being in the union, these governments had been weakened because they could be brought down by a financial market. And therefore, they needed support of some measure, right, to be able to survive in such an environment. Now, this weakness, that is, I've called this birth effect, was initially not really visible. I want to show you now, share a screen. I want to show you something. Just a second. Oops. Yeah, here it is. Here I show you the yields, the government bond yields, 10-year, starting in the year 2000, or no, 1999 until 2021. And you can see that before the crisis, it looked like there was no problem at all. Financial markets really considered Greek bonds and German bonds to be perfect substitutes. And they gave essentially the same risk to these bonds. Then things changed dramatically with the financial crisis, which was a huge shock and then revealed these weaknesses, right? That's what you see here, the yields of countries that typically also were hit more by the financial crisis shot up, and the yields of the others, Germany, the Netherlands, actually went down. So this destabilized the whole system and led to a situation where it was close to collapse, right? But then when you look at the post-crisis, and this leads me to my story, a number of things have happened, right? And that also Waltraud referred to, namely, we set up a support system, right? These individual governments were unable to face these kinds of shocks, and a mutual support system was set in place. In particular, the ECB with its OMT, a lender of last resort function, which was then also strengthened during the pandemic. Banking union, although incomplete, and some timid steps towards a fiscal union, especially with the next generation EU during the pandemic. And as you can see, when the pandemic hit, essentially, we did not have a repeat of the sovereign debt crisis, although the pandemic had in itself, given its size and its intensity, and also its asymmetry, all the potential to create a new sovereign debt crisis. So this did not happen. So in other words, we had learned from what happened in the financial crisis and strengthened the system significantly. Let me show you the next little figure here, where I have enlarged the same figure, so a kind of blow up, and you can see that just prior to the start of the pandemic, the yields were declining. Then you had a small blurb in the yields that occurred essentially at the moment Lagarde came out saying that the ECB was not in the business of controlling the spreads, but then with the PEPP program, this was sufficient to pacify, and we came out of this pandemic quite unscattered. So in other words, that's the grown-up story. We had grown up, strengthened the system such that it could weather the pandemic that, as I just said, had the potential to create a new sovereign debt crisis. This leads me then to the question, but is the euro now a strong adult that can sustain a future shock? And I will analyze this in the second round when Angelo will ask me the correct question to deal with this.
I'll certainly try to do my best. Interesting that both our speakers made references to the human body. Maybe the question led also to such a metaphor. Let me now turn to Martin to conclude this first round of introductory remarks. Martin, you're muted.
So I'm very honored to be part of this group, and I've been fascinated by what people have said. I followed this story very closely. I was writing for the Financial Times throughout the Maastricht negotiations. I talked to everybody involved. I had long conversations with Karl Otto Perl, for example, who did everything he could to stop it, by the way. But I won't talk about any of that now, perhaps later, and I will just go through. I have also a few pictures, terrible vice of economists, and get through as quickly as I can. So I will try to show, let me, right. So ignore the first page. Well, my answer, as always, of course, is it's too soon to tell whether it's grown up. All I would say is it has survived quite big tests, but it remains, as Paul said, fragile, in my view, and we can discuss this later. What I want to cover is basically how I see the story so far in 3 charts. It's incredibly simple. And then what does the eurozone need? What are the things that one might want to do with it? And this is going to be very headline and links with the questions. So the first question is, to me, is, well, if the eurozone was so wonderful, how has it performed economically? How is, as an aggregate group? Remember, it was not only the single currency was introduced in the 90s, but also there was the single market program introduced a little earlier. And this was all intended to ensure that the EU did very well against the US. So this shows GDP per head relative to the US. The US, you should imagine, it purchasing power parity, by the way, constant 2017 prices. The US is 100%. Imagine the US at 100%. The green line is the eurozone. The blue line, by the way, below it, next to it, is the UK. I thought that's fun. I'm going to ignore what happened during COVID because it's special, but obviously the UK did terribly badly. The basic story is the eurozone started out at 80% of US average GDP per head. It was still 80% in 2011, and before the pandemic hit, it had fallen by about 5 percentage points, and all of that happened during the eurozone crisis. But by the way, the UK didn't do much better. So it was neither a real success nor in aggregate, in that sense, a disaster, but it's fallen behind somewhat in average GDP per head. I stress that, the US. The next chart, it's just, I think, more worrying, is what's happened to relative GDP per head. And I'm just looking at 1999 and 2019, and Germany is 100%. So if you imagine there's a German line, Germany is 100%, it's the benchmark. And the red column shows the relative GDP per head in 1999, and the purple column show the relative GDP per head in 2019. And the basic story is Southern Europe's done terribly relative to Northern Europe. Is that just because they're all incompetent, wicked, and stupid people, or is this something to do with the eurozone? I think it has a lot to do, and I'll come with it with the eurozone, and I'll come to that in a second. Of these countries, obviously, the biggest disaster is Italy, whose GDP per head has fallen from being close to Germany's in 1999, close to 100%, to 78% now, and 20 years of relative decline. But even Spain, Portugal, and Greece, all of which you would have thought would be convergence countries, have actually been divergent. And I don't think that's an accident. I think the system is designed to benefit the countries with saving surpluses. It's just inevitable that a system like this would work for the saving surplus countries. That's what I thought 30 years ago, and I think the evidence has supported that very strongly. And the final slide basically support why I think this is so. It's what happens with balance of payments adjustment, or the failure of capital flows, the failure of capital account integration. So if you look back at the current account pattern, which is just the net capital flow pattern, to a significant extent internal, but not only internal, within the eurozone in 2007, and you look at 2017, you can see that the aggregate current account balance of the eurozone was zero. There were huge current account surpluses in countries like Netherlands and Germany. Those were the most important. Those are the red columns. And there were some huge current account deficits as basically the capital markets went crazy. We know this, and the eurozone was very much part of it because, as Paul said, everybody thought all risks were the same. When the crisis hit, this is the purple line, there was essentially no external adjustment by the surplus countries whatsoever. In fact, their surpluses grew, but there was massive compression of demand by the deficit countries. And by 2017, the eurozone was in very substantial surplus, and basically every country in the eurozone was in surplus. And that was a brutal macroeconomic adjustment, which occurred largely through spending compression, because there wasn't really very much relative price change within it. And that's exactly what I would have expected to happen, and it wasn't good. And it's related to what has just happened in terms of relative GDP per head within the eurozone. So my view is that it's difficult to argue the eurozone as a whole, beyond its survival, which is a great achievement, I think, has been an economic success in terms of relative growth, macroeconomic stability, or capital market integration. Fundamental failures of adjustment remains. It's the needed wage flexibility does not exist. You've lost current exchange rate flexibility. And of course, fiscal transfers are very limited, and Waltraud referred to that for very obvious reasons. And a big part of the adjustment shock within the eurozone has been externalized for somewhere else in the world to cope with it. But the ECB and the eurozone have survived the crisis with a host of innovations, which I think are a membership, which are creditable, and membership has proved irreversible. So it's sort of semi-grown up. Finally, my second part, which will be quite brief, what does the eurozone still need? And I think here it's really hard to separate the eurozone from the EU, because so many of the functions of the eurozone are EU functions still. There's an inevitable overlap. But I think it is important that the EU, and so the eurozone, has responded to COVID far more effectively than it did to the financial crisis. I think that's partly because nobody could really be blamed for it. So it didn't get into all that moralistic nonsense we got over the financial crisis. Climate change is not a challenge for the eurozone per se. It is a challenge for the EU and member states, but the ECB can perhaps help a little. The most relevant form of inequality for the eurozone is the divergence among states. And I think the fact that there are a significant number of states that have done economically very badly is a big problem. And it's a problem for the eurozone itself. The monetary, financial, and fiscal systems clearly need developing. And of the three, the second and third, which are connected, are crucial. I do believe that you need not an insignificant amount of fiscal integration if you want financial integration. And I think both of the previous speakers have referred to it. It can survive, but can it really prosper? And to me, the big challenge is, can the eurozone and really all its main members prosper together? Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Martin, for concluding this first round of brief introductory remarks. We will now delve into more specific issues, and we'll try to ask the right questions, as Paul mentioned earlier. So I'll actually start with Paul. Paul, you have written extensively and presented extensively on this idea of fragility, and you have tried to, in a way, distill whether these fragility is endemic or temporary. What is your view on this? What's your answer? And have the loopholes of the architecture that you mentioned before been addressed or not? I'll have to ask you to unmute yourself, Paul.
Oh, I always forget this. Thank you for asking the right question. Right? This reminds me of Charles de Gaulle in his famous press conferences. You know, I was very young at that time, and I liked to watch his press conferences. And one day he started his press conferences, and he said, "These are the questions that I would like you to pose to me, and here are the answers." So this is similar, although I'm not Charles de Gaulle, of course, but I do think that you asked the right question. So let me try to answer this, right? And reformulate the question as follows. Is the euro a healthy adult, right? So it has survived. So you can say, yeah, after 30 years, that's something, it has survived. But is it healthy enough, capable of sustaining future shocks? Because let's face it, there will be future shocks, right? That's the question then now. Do we now have the architecture that allow us to go through further turbulence in the future? And here I would first want to concentrate on the ECB, right? The ECB, as I argued, and as everybody knows, has accepted its role of being the lender of last resort, not only for the banks, because that was accepted right from the start, but also in the government bond markets, right? This was the innovation for the ECB with the OMT, right? And the question is, are we sure that this thing is there for forever? Can we be sure? Is this OMT thing a credible announcement? And here we have a problem, which is the following: a contrast between standalone countries and the eurozone. Take the UK and the Bank of England, the UK government and the Bank of England. It is clear that if a crisis erupts and the UK government finds itself with a liquidity squeeze, the Bank of England will be there to provide liquidity so that financial markets cannot bring down the UK government, right? Because there is a superior force, the Bank of England, that will be forced to provide liquidity. There's no doubt about this. Nobody can doubt about this. Look at the eurozone. You have one central bank, the ECB, and 19 governments, none of which has control over the ECB. And therefore, this promise of OMT, of lender of last resort, is not fully credible, because it is at the discretion of the ECB in the future to do it. And we don't know who will be in there, right, at the ECB. None of these governments can actually force. There is one thing that adds to this lack of credibility, and that has to do with the fact that the OMT, although unlimited in its promise, is conditional on doing austerity, which confuses liquidity and austerity and solvency problems. The central bank should only intervene to provide liquidity when there is a liquidity crisis, but not if it is a solvency crisis. And yet the OMT confuses both both dimensions, right? By saying, okay, there will be unlimited support, but it will be conditional. And by being conditional, you create the impression, actually, this is to solve a solvency crisis. And this creates a possibility for the ECB in the future to say, sorry, this is a solvency crisis. And it actually happened already with the second Greek crisis. The ECB said, none of our business, it's a solvency problem. I will not provide liquidity, right? We have to do something different, restructuring and all that, which of course is true if it is a solvency crisis, but this ambiguity leads to a lack of credibility. And therefore we cannot be certain that ECB, when new severe shocks arise and individual governments have to be supported, will be ready to do so, right? So how can we solve this? Well, this can only be solved if we create some political authority that is on top of the ECB and can force that institution to do the job in times of crisis. But we are far from this, right? This is a kind of political union that is very intrusive, and we don't have it. Therefore, we still have a problem there, right? It's a grown up. The eurozone is grown up, yes, has survived the pandemic now because we did a number of right things, support systems, but we are not sure that when severe crises erupt again in the future, the same will happen. We don't know. And here I would like to connect with what Martin said. If it turns out that chronically the eurozone delivers inferior macroeconomic results, well, then the political support for such a system will weaken. And as a result, we might still have big problems in the future. So we are condemned, so to say, to create. So people have said the euro is a currency without a country, right? So we are condemned to create a country to be able to support in the long run the monetary system that actually today has no sovereign. In other words, we need to create a sovereign, right? National governments, none of them are sovereign any longer, and we have not created a sovereign at the European level, and that remains a basic weakness of this architecture that we have created. Let me say just a few more things about fiscal union. It's clear that part of this creation of a sovereign also implies creating a fiscal union. Waltraud, she uses the term reinsurance, but clearly reinsurance, it's more than, say, reinsurance in private markets, that we understand, right? But I guess we want to do more than that, because when crises erupt, insurance mechanisms in private markets collapse. We cannot rely on private insurance mechanisms during crisis. We need political systems to do that. And you can call it reinsurance, which means creating a political institution at a eurozone level that is capable of doing the necessary transfers, right, to support countries in times of crisis. And we have been trying to do that now with the next generation EU, which is a step in the right direction, but it's still relatively small. And we will have to see whether we can go on in the direction that I think is inevitable if we want to make sure that this adult that the eurozone now is remains one that is healthy enough to support big shocks in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So for the LSE European Institute students in the audience, this exchange will also be part of the course that actually Waltraud and Paul co-teach on the political economy of European monetary integration. So you will hear more of these different views on this exchange in the next months. And it actually reminded me when I was actually a seminar teacher for that course, and I asked the students, so what do you think is the job of a central bank? And everyone was saying, of course, changing the interest rate or for instance, supervising the financial sector and so on. And what I actually wanted to hear is more, they are in the business of credibility. And it's, I mean, credibility, as we have seen also, not just the ECB, but for many central banks, is the key in order to, especially, you know, with some speeches, how much, you know, the credibility of a central bank is key to change market sentiment and expectations. But on these 2 points that were raised by Paul, the role of the ECB and also I mentioned at the end, Next Generation EU, I would like to hear Waltraud. So my question is, the sovereign debt crisis, in a way, highlighted how much the fate of the euro is linked to the actions of a strong central bank, the ECB. And when the pandemic struck, it seemed we had a much faster reaction time. So do you think as the shadow of the past, in a way, dictated the path? And how much is the fate of the eurozone actually linked to the one of the EU, as Martin was hinting at earlier, especially in a way, in a forward-looking perspective? How much do you think with recent path-breaking decisions, for instance, RRF, determine the future of the currency?
Yes, thank you. Before I answer your very good question, obviously, let me just briefly say 2 things, one to Paul and one to Martin. First of all, I do not think that we are at an end, and at 30 you still develop and grow, right, as a person. So will the euro area. But I think we really do need, and therefore at some point we have to go away from the metaphors. And if we say what more is needed, then the model is not become like the United States, a full-fledged fiscal federation. Because there are studies, Jonathan Rodden, Eric Wibbles are the foremost scholars in this, that just show how bad the United States works, exactly because it has a strong center. And so the states recklessly free ride on the stabilization effort of the center, counteract the automatic stabilization of the central budget, and are always, you know, the virtuous and complain about the swamp and the debt management at the federal level, while they totally depend for stabilization on that. So if you become a bit more political and don't just list the functional necessities of a fiscal federation, you would just see that when you introduce a federal budget, a central budget, there is a response from the states that can make the whole system worse. And this is my starting point. And this is why I think at the moment, when you also can't just assume away that the demos of this future euro area fiscal union is not there, and that people do not want, neither those who would benefit at the moment, that kind of control that then comes with it, nor the others who feel they are the virtuous and all that, want to share the fiscal policy to that extent with a shared budget with other member states, and they have the support of a majority of their national populations with it. So we cannot ignore that. And therefore I'm saying, what is then the next best thing? And perhaps even a better alternative than the US has at the moment, because I think it's a dismal budgetary system, is a reinsurance for these tail risks that are partly created by the euro area itself, namely through financial integration, for example. And then Martin Wolf, to say that the euro area was created to benefit Germany, designed to benefit Germany, then I would want to know why you think there is in Germany, exactly from these people who, you know, mourn the good old Germany that's no longer there. The resistance is there. They do not embrace the euro area. The fact is, Germany has done pretty well outside of the euro. Deficit countries and surplus countries exist outside of the euro area. And what would have happened in this financial crisis is rampant financial crisis in those countries that the markets liked to pick up for good or bad reasons. And therefore, I think what is now different is that countries like Germany and the Netherlands cannot walk away anymore from the mess that they partly create, and that we too agree. But they cannot walk away anymore and leave it to the IMF to get these countries back into the markets, and then a new round starts. And that brings me then to the questions that Angelo has asked me. I mean, in the beginning, I think the ECB did actually pretty badly. The ECB's very first reaction was like that of the EU's COVID interventions in the beginning generally. They tried their best, and actually not all was wrong what they did, but they projected complete incompetence. I mean, Lagarde's famous press conference in which he says, we are not here to close the spreads, when that was the essence of what the ECB did rightly since 2010. And when she actually wanted to say, we close the spread if you member states as fiscal authorities take responsibility and help each other and intervene forcefully with fiscal stimulus or fiscal compensation mechanisms during this pandemic. But she said the opposite, right? Even the program that she announced at that point was a fairly well thought out program. They now say we refinance and pay banks to lend on to businesses. So that was some innovation, that there is some strings attached to this massive handout that happens and actually creates little more than a lot of instability in financial markets again. I think what was so remarkable about the last year in terms of EU crisis management is that there was this strong political pushback, especially from Italy and Spain, of not having the shadow of the past. You know, the ESM with strict conditionality and all that stuff dictate the future. In a contribution to a JCMS annual review, I actually traced this politics of path breaking that Conte, Sanchez, and also Macron engaged in. They insisted that this crisis is different, that citizens of countries in dire straits expect better from other member states than being lectured about their duties, and that a common debt instrument is now required. They made the use of the ESM with conditionality a taboo. And with that, Paul, I also think the OMT is off the table. It was, I think, more the silence from Germany when the OMT was announced that created this effect, not the OMT itself. It wasn't usable before, and it is not usable now, especially. And so these governments from Southern Europe, in particular from the two big Southern European countries, played a risky game, but they won. And Italy in particular made it clear that if its government does not cooperate, the European Stability Mechanism, as this officially dubbed firewall, will not work for those on the safe side of the firewall either. And Merkel understood this. And she also understood that if she wants to end the Corona bonds debate, you know, this common debt instrument, she must offer something astounding. As she herself said, I think after a press conference with Sanchez, something massive beyond the numbers is necessary, something that is a political signal of solidarity. And that was what the Franco-German proposal for a recovery fund of 500 billion euros of grants was about. It was completely unexpected in the Commission. Nobody knew about this, but it changed the political economy of doing fiscal integration without going all the way to a central budget all along. And then to come back to your second question, Angelo, of whether this is a sign that the fate of the euro area is linked to that of the EU. Yes, and it is, but that's a given and always has been. More immediately, I think, however, that it suited Merkel enormously to make this an EU rather than a euro area reform. Above all, to deflect from a Eurobond debate, but also because the Eurobond would have only been for euro area countries, but also to send a signal to non-euro area members, that the non-euro members, that one wants them to be in that, because she has understood that Brexit was a warning sign. What can happen if one is not aware of the sensitivities of countries outside of the euro area. And therefore, this was an entirely politically driven reform process. But I think in the end, it made a lot of sense, even in economic terms.
Thank you very much, Waltraud. I think you've raised also some of the points that will be tackled by Martin. And Martin, with your comment about who is actually benefiting from this system, it seems you have struck a few chords. Also in the Q&A, we will tackle this topic if you don't want to address it now, besides the point raised by Waltraud. But so about the Q&A, actually, let me remind everyone that you can use the function at the bottom of our Zoom the webinar platform, and some of you I've seen have already started writing them up, and I will take them as soon as we finish this round, so be prepared. Martin, the ECB, like other central banks, seems to be no longer concerned just with inflation and employment, but also worries, as you were pointing out also in some of your articles recently, about climate change, inequality, more recently digital currencies. Do you think the ECB is better equipped to meet these challenges compared to the Federal Reserve, for instance, because there is less political polarization regarding these challenges? And also feel free to tackle the question that was raised by Waltraud, if you feel like. I think you're muted, Mark.
I apologize. I'm so excited by the discussion that I forget to do this. I think this is a wonderful discussion. I think that perhaps because I had to cram a lot into 7 minutes, I wasn't as clear as I like to think I am. I didn't want to suggest, so this is in response to Waltraud, I didn't want to suggest for a moment that Germany wanted the euro because it thought it would benefit from it. I followed the debate in the early 90s, late 80s and early 90s in Germany very closely, and it was pretty clear, it was 100% clear that it was overwhelmingly a political decision taken in the teeth of the opposition of most of the economic establishment. Though I should say I knew and know, though many of them are now dead, many leading German business people, very different from the people at large or the economic establishment associated particularly with the Bundesbank, who were very keen on it because, to put it bluntly, they wanted to stop Italian devaluations. But broadly speaking, Waltraud is correct. They didn't want it. Nonetheless, as I expected, so I was reflecting my position, not the German position, as I expected once it happened, it ran pretty well from their point of view. And I can't explain it at great length, but in financial crises, and financial crises tend to happen with liberalized finance, it's really far better to be a surplus country than a deficit one. And if you knock out the exchange rate as an adjustment mechanism and impose all the adjustment on the deficit countries and consider them to be pretty wicked and immoral to boot, then you have both an economic and political problem. And I think it gets bigger partly because it's so obviously a blame game in this context, and partly because the loss of familiar mechanisms of adjustment, however undesirable, like the exchange rate, which, contrary to many views, I think worked rather well for Italy for a long time. You have other adjustment mechanisms and they don't work very well, and they didn't. So that's all I wanted to say about the history, and it bears then on the other big thing, which I think is very, very important, because we're looking where they've got to in the future, because they got through that crisis better than many feared. I remember I wrote a column about this in 2012. I met a lot of people in Wall Street, and I wrote a column in response to them, all of whom assumed the eurozone was going to die in 2012, all of them. And I wrote a whole column saying it probably wouldn't happen because I didn't think Germany would let it happen. And that was correct. But they struggled through. Now, the point about the COVID crisis, which may help our future discussions, is that it was a crisis for everybody. It affected countries differently, but it was a crisis for everybody. Climate is the same. And so it's, if you like, it's a homogeneous shock. And it's not a moral shock in the sense you can't say, anybody is to blame. Some people now say China is to blame. I'll leave that aside. But anybody is to blame for COVID. It's the same with climate. So if you can't act collectively in response to a massive external shock for which nobody is to blame, then you're basically a completely dysfunctional union. And they showed they aren't. That's very, very important. And I think very encouraging. And I also agree with her completely that you don't want to be the US. I talked about some aspect of it, but you need to show a willingness to insure one another, and that means some fiscal mechanisms. You know, that has an implication of my third point about the ECB. I remain concerned about what would happen, which is what Paul talked about, if we get large heterogeneous shocks. And particularly, you know, you get a crisis in which you can plausibly say some big country or other is to blame, and that could still be an enormous mess. And the fact that they acted together now doesn't prove it won't. And I'm not going to detail it, but if, I express, if Italy at some point looked like Greece in 2015, it would be a big mess. I think that is true. Now, the final point I wanted to make, it comes to your point. I am very concerned in a way it shows the undevelopment of the eurozone, but it's a broader point because it actually applies to the UK and elsewhere. There is a very strong desire, particularly now that the central banks have got into the money printing business big time, let's use the colloquial term, that people who want something to happen about climate think, or inequality, think that the central bank can fix this. And my view is that's politically dangerous. It's not their responsibility. They have no political mandate for it. And these are intensely political decisions with profound sectoral effects, profound interpersonal justice effects. And they're not competent to do it either. And, you know, the climate capabilities of the ECB are very limited. The fact that people want the ECB to do things, and that somebody like Christine Lagarde, who's a very activist person, wishes to respond, is, to my mind, a failure of European politics. So to build on Waltraud's point, it seems to me that the next stage of this, and I'm not saying the EU should become like the US, it never will, obviously, but the next stage is to build on what happened to COVID, in response to COVID, to create a more coherent capacity for political leadership in what are massive long-term political challenges for the EU as a whole and its member states. And climate is the biggest one of all, but there are many others. And I think the view that politicians now have, that they can leave everything to the ECB, is actually disturbing, because it's, as I said, not legitimate and cannot really be effective.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think you made your points very clear, and we all share some sort of concern also on these points, although I presume that Paul might have a different view on this, but I don't want to monopolize my role as chair. And as promised, I will now move into the Q&A part of our event today. So as you can see, I also have you have the chance to vote on the questions, and on top of the list, I see one of our alumni, Martin Fischer, from our Political Economy of Europe program from last year, and it's a question to all speakers, and it reads as follows: to be considered grown up, does the euro need to become an international reserve currency? Would that help the EU as a whole to emancipate itself from the US? Which steps will be needed for that? I don't know whether we should start with this, or you want me to collect also. I'll take also another question, because I think it's linked to this growing up phase, which is another question from Asger Torfason from actually the Icelandic Fiscal Council, which is a member. And the question to the panel is, will the euro area be enlarged now that the euro is somewhat a grown teenager? Is it solid to grow up or as is, or can it grow with additional siblings merged into it? And to clarify, I'm not asking from the viewpoint of the smallest currency of the world, in my little island, Iceland, that is part of the European Economic Area, but rather from the point of the uncle Danish krona that is back to the euro. It's bigger and independent sister, the Swedish krona, for examples. We're flourishing with analogies and metaphors this afternoon. So I'll on the growth and on the question about international reserve currency. If any of our speakers would like to take the floor, please go ahead.
I'm prepared to talk about the first. I have no view on the second.
Martin, please.
I'll provoke Paul. I feel that as a citizen, alas, of a country that left the EU, I have no role in discussing the enlargement of the eurozone, though it's pretty obvious when you look at some of the larger potential candidates, say Poland, there are some problems. I was a little puzzled by this question because the euro already is a reserve currency. I think it is the second largest reserve currency. Obviously, it's well behind the dollar. I haven't looked recently. My memory is it's about a quarter of world reserves. That might be wrong, but it's in that sort of order. So it has become a reserve currency. And my view is that the role of a currency as a reserve currency is actually a response largely to market forces. I mean, which include other governments, obviously, in the sense that the more trade is conducted in this currency, the more finance is conducted in this currency. So the bigger your financial sector gets as part of the world, the more trusted this currency is, the more people will invoice in it, use it, trade it, and then naturally, governments will increasingly use it. So if we looked at the history of reserve currencies, this is largely in response to the perceived soundness, political backing, financial development, and all the rest of it. And that's what happened when the dollar replaced sterling. And so it really depends, to my mind, on how the eurozone itself evolves. If I look at that, I don't see any alternative. I don't believe in the renminbi as a reserve currency. I've written a lot about that over the last 15 years, and I've been right in my judgment it wouldn't happen. But the development, obviously, the more credible the survival of the eurozone is, which we're talking about core, the more likely it is to become a reserve currency. That's better now than it was 20 years ago. The more developed the financial system and deep and liquid it is, the more likely to become reserve currency. That's still quite a big problem if you compare euro markets with dollar markets. Having a common financial instrument, equivalent to the treasury, is a help. If you want a reserve currency, people want to hold an asset which is very liquid, very safe, and backed by the state. That's clearly a problem for the eurozone because it doesn't have that, and Eurobonds aren't going to happen, so it probably won't happen in the near future. But I would expect, and of course, the eurozone economy is not growing relative to the world, but shrinking, which is also a problem. So I would expect the euro to remain number 2 currency unless the US commits suicide, perfectly possible, and the not to grow massively, but it is likely to remain, as long as the eurozone survives, the second most important reserve currency for, not forever, but for the indefinite future. That's my judgment. For the indefinite future, until China completely transforms itself into something totally unimaginable at the moment.
Thank you. Waltraud, you wanted to come in?
Did you ask me?
Yes,
Paul. I can briefly say I agree with a lot of what Martin said. I am sometimes a bit surprised that I have the impression that the US fights a bit to stay, so to speak, the hegemonic reserve currency, while I think there is a bit of a difference between the fiscal, or generally the elected part of politics, and the Federal Reserve, because for the Federal Reserve it clearly is a constraint. It's not a degree of freedom to issue the world currency. We have seen that several times when the Fed wanted to actually get out of this extremely accommodative stance, then there was some tantrum, some problem in emerging markets, and they had to wind down. I think it would be extremely difficult for the euro area to play this role because of its diversity. If you then have to have an interest rate policy that is actually determined by your relationship with the rest of the world rather than internal conditions, that would be probably a step too far, apart from, as Martin says, this is something that has to be accepted by market. You can force it to some extent, but not completely and not decisively, I don't think. Just something on the question from the Icelandic Fiscal Council. If we talk about the Denmark, yes, of course, happily they would accept Denmark, and de facto it is a member of the euro area. It shadows the euro area so closely. I guess some would hope that Norway comes in with its big sovereign wealth fund. Poland and the whole eastern side of things is another matter, and also the size of ever more smallish countries creates a problem with decision making in the ECB. So I have never had the impression that they're terribly keen to expand, which goes totally against what political economists always think, you know, more hegemony, more power, more bigger realm is better. I think our decision makers are smarter than that. It creates a lot of difficulties as well.
Thank you, Waltraud. Then let me turn to Paul.
Okay, yeah, maybe on the reserve currency, maybe add some dimension, which is the fact that the dollar is not only a reserve currency at central banks, but it is also part of, in fact, it is the international payment system, right? Many payments now, dollar payments, are organized by the US through the US banking system. And that, as we have seen, gives quite a political leverage. Huh? We have seen it with sanctions vis-a-vis Iran, that the US can actually reach to European companies, punish European companies that try to deal with Iran. And that has to do with the fact that the whole international payment system is still dollar-based. In other words, has to go through the US banking system. And that's another dimension to a reserve currency. And in that sense, the euro is not a reserve currency. Of course, it is important in international trade, no doubt. And as Martin said, it is the second in the world, but it does not have a payment system organized around the euro that potentially could give the kind of political leverage to, I don't know, in Europe, who would want to use it. That's another matter, right? In the US, it's very clear who wants to use this kind of political leverage. It's unclear who would want to use that in Europe, and whether there would be any consensus on how to use it. That's another matter. On the second question, yeah, I think further, well, as you know, EU countries, when the countries that entered the EU signed up to joining the eurozone, right? So we should expect more to come in, and that surely is a problem, right? If anything, this will increase the risk of future crisis, and so it will increase the fragility of the eurozone. It's not good news, but here we are. We have done that, and at some point, many of these countries will want to join, and I'm not sure this is a good idea, but we are condemned to do it, so to say. We have written it down in treaties, and I think that's a very risky future.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Yeah.
And thank you for also the points made by Martin and Waltraud. I'm looking now at the list of questions that we received. I'll probably take a couple of questions that are pretty much linked. The one by Ronald Janssen from Global Deal says, to what extent does keeping this progress in the euro growing up depend on the political situation in a key country, Germany in particular? Can one imagine a scenario where we go back on the flexibility we now finally have on both monetary as well as fiscal policy because of different political choices from the new government that is shaping up? Think of the return of the Stability Pact discipline, for example. And because it's linked actually to this, I have a question by Carmine Soprano that seems to have quite a few affiliations. World Bank economist, economic advisor to Italian G20's presidency, LSE MPA student, and also Martin, for you, loyal FT reader. He asks, given political constraints on prospects of fiscal union Eurobonds, how about something like a permanent next generation EU program, maybe backed by a reform of growth and stability pact as a second best option to address structural limits of Euro? So again, first question by Ronald Janssen on how much will Germany then determine the likely scenario that we see moving forward, and if in a way, given the political constraints, is it how about something like a permanent next generation EU, although that's also constrained politically and maybe backed by a reform of growth and stability pact. I don't know who would like to start, maybe Waltraud tackling the first question, and then I yield the floor to the other speakers.
So I am one who says one can overestimate the influence of Germany. I know one always looks at it, and it is certainly an important country in all these debates. But the idea, and we looked at it from a data set that actually people in EMU Choices have done. We're speaking of Truchlewski, who's actually in the audience. We did a paper where we analyzed to what extent is Germany clearly in this frugal four coalition against other coalitions. And Germany is actually not consistently in all the 47 EMU reforms that they looked at, consistently on the side of the frugal ones. And it very often loses, in particular with the banking union. Germany was the outlier in terms of opposing almost everything. And, you know, we got a banking union. So the idea that Germany can block everything, now that the euro area is there and that Germany has shown it will not let it fall, is, I think, not true. At the same time, yes, if there is, as always in the EU, if they cannot find a new compromise, then the status quo is the default position. And we have still this Stability and Growth Pact. However, I had last week a debate on which Vito Constantio was the former ECB vice president, and he said that fiscal rules, even though they were never exercised in terms of never any punishment, they did play a role for the austerity policies 2009-10 following. But at the same time, they work then in a very different way, and we have to look at why do they work, for which countries do they work? Is there sometimes perhaps also a willingness of governments to say, I use this as a leverage at home when I want to do a restraining fiscal policy, because nobody can tell me that the fiscal rules that have been hardened and reformed since their beginning have forced. Troika programs are a different thing, because there is the problem that you need bailout funding, and then they have been brutal in their enforcement of austerity measures. But for the rest, France, Spain, no, they haven't worked, and they haven't forced anybody. So I would not consider what is your underlying assumption, Ronald Janssen. I wouldn't see that as such a big deal.
Thank you very much, Waltraud. Let me turn to Paul then.
Which question?
So on the question of whether you think that Germany will continue to have an undue weight in the discussions that on the next reforms that will be adopted, and whether you see actually as next generation EU becoming permanent, and the reform of the Growth and Stability Pact as a sort of second best option to address the structural limits of the euro.
Well, oops, yeah, I'm unmuted. I share Waltraud's view that one can easily exaggerate the German influence, but one should not also fall in the reverse trap, right? On the fiscal rules, and the debate that is going on now, should we go back to these fiscal rules? Because for the moment, they have been set aside because of the pandemic, but there is the crucial date of next year, in fact, when these fiscal rules could very well be put into place again, and how will they look like? And that is unclear at this moment. I suspect that Germany will be quite important. Very much will depend, of course, also on the nature of the government in Germany, right? What kind of coalition comes out of these negotiations. So it's very difficult to say at this stage, but surely these fiscal rules should be changed. I mean, let me just focus on one, right, which is the balanced budget rule, which is one of the most stupid rules one could have imagined, right, where we say to governments that over the business cycle you cannot add new debt, which also means that you cannot finance public investment by the issue of bonds, right, which at this stage is certainly so self-destructive, because we will need massive amount of public investment for taking up the challenge of the environment and what have you. And here in the eurozone, if we return to that, and there is some probability that we return to that, we will handicap ourselves to deal with these crucial issues, making it impossible to finance public investment by issuing bonds. It's also based on the confusion that we should only look at gross debt and not net debt, right? I mean, when governments do public investment, they create both assets and liabilities. And if the return on these assets that they create exceeds the cost of borrowing, which today in most eurozone countries is actually zero, then in the future, net debt will tend to decline. But the failure to see that is such an aberration and irrational. We really have to do something to make sure that we do not return to such stupidity, because it would really handicap eurozone countries to meet the challenge of the future.
Well, let me just return to a point actually made by Martin just on this, because you mentioned the expanding budgets and the need to actually have those. Martin was saying how though an enlarged mandate, in a way, an expanded mandate for the ECB, for instance, may turn out to be politically dangerous when it starts to tackle questions such as climate change, inequality. What's your view on this, just to follow up on what was said by Martin?
Well, first of all, the treaty says that it is in the mandate of the ECB, right? When you look at the treaty, it says that the price stability is the primary objective of the ECB, right? But then it adds to that, provided, I'm not quoting literally, provided price stability is not endangered, the ECB should pursue the economic policy objectives of the European Union as set out in the treaty. And then you look at the article and it actually includes also the environment. So from a legal point of view, there is no enlargement of the mandate, provided what the ECB is doing there is not endangering price stability. So the question is, how can that be done? That's another issue, right? I have proposed something, this creation, I'm not alone to have done this, which is the following. The ECB has now a large portfolio of government bonds on its balance sheet and has in fact promised that it will keep that portfolio of bonds on its balance sheet unchanged. That is, it will not reduce it, right? It is actually adding today with the PEPP program, it's continuing to buy. But prior to the pandemic, it had in fact said that when bonds come to maturity, then it will buy new bonds in the secondary markets to replenish its bond portfolio. And here was my proposal. It said that, well, let the ECB then, instead of buying government bonds that have come to maturity, say, for example, Italian bond has come to maturity, instead of buying an Italian bond to substitute for the one that has come to maturity, let the ECB buy so-called green bonds. This could be bonds issued by the EIB in the context of a program of making public investment in the environment and what have you, and put that on its balance sheet, right? Now, that would be a way to create green money without actually increasing the money base, because you would just keep it constant, right? If you think the stock of asset on the balance sheet of the ECB is not inflationary at this stage, well, it just changes the nature of the bonds, and it would therefore not add to money base, and therefore would not add an inflationary impulse. Now, when you look through this and when you think through to this, what you find then is that in my example that I gave, the Italian Treasury would now be forced to issue new bonds, right? Because as long as it was on the balance sheet of the ECB, it came to maturity, it was the ECB that would buy new Italian bonds in the secondary market, relieving the Italian Treasury to actually issue net new bonds, right? Now it would have to do it, but that's the beauty of the proposal. It would actually be a way to circumvent the schwarze Null, to circumvent the balanced budget rule, whereby all these governments actually would have to issue bonds for every green bond that the ECB now has on its balance sheet, right? And so, in other words, you would circumvent this silly rule. And I'm saying, let's do it.
Thank you, Paul. I think Martin will certainly have something to say about this. And we actually had a follow-up question from our audience, from one of our students, Felix Zenhauser, suggesting, in a way, trying to summarize his question is, but doesn't one have to admit that the ECB quantitative easing policy has actually strongly favored portfolios with a high share of investment in environmentally damaging projects? And since ECB policies always have a political implication, shouldn't we push ECB even harder to introduce better regulation of environmentally friendly investment and counter the risk of greenwashing? So I'll turn it to you.
I accept. Well, first of all, to go back, it's obvious to the early question, which fits with this. I do think, perhaps this is very British, but I do think that where the EU as a political entity can define for itself a shared collective goal, which is a very good thing to have, and it's a good goal, such as dealing with climate change, which is clearly a very long-term program. You know, it's not going to stop in a few years. We're at the beginning of a journey which will take 30 years, and we hope to get much of it done in 20 years, and which involves enormous investments, many of them public sector investments. Then it does seem to me both desirable and sensible that the EU has means collectively to invest, which get outside, and I agree with Paul here, all these ridiculous rules, and because clearly it's going to involve a lot of investment, and which particularly help those countries which have, under those rules, limited fiscal capacity. I mean, it doesn't do much good if only the most solvent governments are able to make these green investments. So how that is done is the second order, but the first order is to do this. Now, it seems to me second, this is where I do differ a bit, but ideally, these are intensely political decisions and politicians should make them. This is perhaps a very British perspective. And I'm not, you know, and therefore, you know, in Britain, I don't want the Bank of England to decide our climate policy. That's what the government's for. And for that reason, I think the new economic, what is it called? New economic program. I probably got it wrong. The fiscal plan that they have should be made indefinite. Yeah, I think that would be highly desirable, possibly climate linked, to be part of a long-term program. And maybe there are some other issues similar to that where they should be spending, and that would be desirable. But that's 2A. 2B, Yes, I can perfectly well see that with a constrained sovereign or a shadow or a strange sovereign or whatever it is at the EU level, you can ask the ECB to get involved in this because there isn't anything else. And I see how Paul's idea might work, though. Well, I've got some technical questions which we don't have enough time to discuss. Dealing with the stock of bonds, how that recycles into deficits and so forth. But I do think it is a little problematic. As you said, the question asked, I want to make sure that the bonds don't involve greenwashing. Well, I've just been actually in a seminar last night with lots of lawyers and bankers in the city on the very question. Well, deciding whether something is greenwashing is really hard. It's not a trivial question. Deciding whether a bond is genuinely green or not is really hard. So if we want the ECB to be the dominant decider of this and the politicians accept it, then we must expect the ECB to create a capacity, which I don't think it has now, to do climate policy. Now, it may well be that the best solution is for the EIB to do that, for the ECB to solve that, to finance that. If the IB has that capacity, and I don't know enough about its current situation, and if the leaders of the EU are happy with the EIB doing this at scale, and we are talking obviously trillions here, and if the ECB is a funder and it fits into their monetary program, fine. But that means that the does and must fit into the monetary program, and that's the core of it.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think we have heard some very important points made by all the speakers, and I have probably one last question that comes from the Q&A. Actually, a couple more questions now. The first one that I would like to probably direct to Paul is the question of reversibility of the euro from Alan Simmons. Lots of discussions of problems and measures needed if euro is to survive, but is there any alternative? Is there any way in which the euro could be dismantled in anything approaching an orderly fashion, even if there was a will to do so? And so Paul, I don't know if you have a direct answer to these on the question of reversibility, of actually with speeches like the whatever it takes at the OMT, we have actually.
The answer is very clear. No, there is no way to do it in an orderly fashion. If it happens, it will be a disorderly, chaotic, whatever fashion, right? I don't see how countries would sit around the table and say, now let's deconstruct the euro in like you deconstruct a building. Yeah, you have seen these buildings that put all the dynamite in the building, and then it beautifully collapses without collateral damage, right? That is not going to be the case if it comes to that, right? Let's hope it doesn't, but one should not exclude this. I mean, everything that man has made can be deconstructed and can disappear and probably will disappear. So, but yeah, we have there's no signs of how to deconstruct the eurozone in an orderly fashion.
Okay, so if Martin and Waltraud don't have other points to add to these, I'll actually take the last question, two questions together, and then we wrap it up. So the first one is from Giulio Colazzo, who is an LSE alumnus 2018-19, and he's referring to the recent energy price rise in global and also in the recent bottlenecks in global supply chain and the inflation surge related to the recovery of the economic activity. Could this lead to the ECB tightening its monetary policy stance prematurely on the example, for instance, of the Fed's tapering announcement, and what would be the impact of a hurried money-based construction on the debt servicing capacity for EMU's member states with deteriorated fundamentals? Well, I'll actually let the speakers think about these questions for a second, because it's not a trivial one at all, since it considers a lot of factors, bottlenecks, inflation surge, and so on, and what this means for the EMU's debt servicing capacity. I'll also take then the last question that we have from, again, Carmine Soprano is saying, with regard to the ECB strategic review, do you see that as minor step forward from the bank's 2% inflation targeting obsession, and probably a step away from the 2% inflation target obsession? Could that increase ECB credibility as lender of last resort vis-a-vis international markets investors? So I don't know who wants to take the first question on the outlook forward, and the second question about the ECB strategic review, whether it actually goes in the right direction also vis-a-vis international markets and investors.
Martin, you have thought a lot about it already.
Well, it's very difficult right now. Central banks are all facing uncertainty. What I imagine, I'm sure Paul will say this, is that the ECB will try to avoid tightening as long as it possibly can, looking at the composition of the current ECB Council and the situation in the EU economy. And that's probably the right thing to do, if even given their targets, given what are still likely to be temporary shocks, but not certain to be so. The difficulty, of course, is in part a deeply political one. I mean, as Paul helped to point out, which I didn't want to respond to, the EU treaty is pretty clear what the primary goal of the ECB is. And though it can argue away pretty large overshoots of temporary inflation as being, and it's obviously that's part of what it's tried to do with its reconsideration of its mandate, a part of it, to make it more symmetrical and obviously by implication, I think also to make it more long-term, to focus more on core inflation, focus on core inflation. Nonetheless, if headline inflation remains elevated for long periods, I mean, well above target, and begins to start affecting how the labor market responds as the recovery proceeds, I think it will be impossible for them to avoid taking measures to tighten, and that quite possibly more quickly than they really would want, because that is their dominant mandate. And at some point, the politics will become very difficult if they didn't do this. And given the uncertainty about where we are in terms of the shock and the longer term behavior of inflation and our economies in this unique recovery, because it's a unique shock, all this is going to be pretty difficult, and nobody knows for sure what the right thing to do will actually be. But I think it could become really quite politically difficult for them if this overshoot continues.
It can be short, and then Paul has a bit more time after that. Giulio, sorry, Giulio, I do not quite share your concern that the central banks would go now into overdrive in tightening. I think they will err on the side of being accommodative, because they don't want to rock the boat. We may have zombie banks that we don't recognize at the moment, and nobody wants to kind of create a big mess. So if anything, they err on that side. That raises then that other question by Carmine, namely whether the 2% obsession with inflation is overdone. And I think it is. I mean, it's part of the solution that we inflate some of the debt away, of public debt, but also perhaps the private debt. So the debtors need some support. The problem is always, can you keep it at 3%, 4%, which I think would not be a problem for a while. And frankly, to the extent that the inflation is driven by more expensive energy prices, that is actually part of the climate change agenda. And we say we should rein in this use of non-reproducible resources that future generations may have a better use of than us driving around with all these gas guzzlers. So that is my comment as to the militant cyclist here. That should be let feed through, and that in some sectors of the economy, particularly truck drivers, so logistics, transport, there are now higher wages. Well, that is overdue. These guys live a terrible life and do not even get remunerated for it. But of course, if it becomes then a wider cost push, demand pull inflation, well, then they will have to tighten. But I don't think they will be very, very harsh.
Thank you, Waltraud. Paul?
Well, I think I share most of what has been said, but there is so much uncertainty, not only uncertainty whether this is something temporary or more permanent, how this will affect the rest of the economy. Will we be going to a wage price spiral like we have seen in the 1970s? And then the greatest uncertainty is how will monetary authorities react? They will make policy mistakes. There is a rule that they will make policy mistakes, right? I have never known a period where no policy mistakes were made. And you usually don't know it ex ante, you only know it ex post. So we just don't know. It's perfectly possible that, as Waltraud said, they will say, no, it's not the moment to now push the brakes, but you don't know. I mean, the perception that can exist at the central bank at certain moments is such that they actually might do it. I mean, we don't know. So there's so much uncertainty that, yeah, and it's a little bit disturbing, but that's the way it is, right? One last point about the question that Carmine was raising. Yes, this new strategy of the ECB goes in the right direction. I mean, many economists have been saying for years that this asymmetric 2% inflation target was not the right way to go about. I would add, like Waltraud was saying, we probably can afford a little more than 2%, right? Let me remind you that prior to the eurozone in Germany, the average inflation in the post-war period from the 60s on until the start of the eurozone was more than 3%. And everybody was saying, well, Germany is the example of stability, right? 3%. If today you say in Germany, let's go for 3%, many economists that I know in Germany would immediately say, what? Hyperinflation, right? While they have had it for decades. So we have to calm down here, and probably it would be better to go to rather 3% than 2%, but who am I?
Thank you, Paul. I think it's very difficult to make any forecasts at the moment and to give a definition to what transitory is and whether we are in reflation, stagflation with such an unusual recession, unusual recovery that we have witnessed. So it's been a great pleasure to have the opportunity, I think, both me personally and also I think for all of you to listen to our speakers today. Thank you to our panel for such an excellent discussion. And actually to all of you in the audience for listening, watching, and actually for asking great questions. So if you'd like to learn more about the European Institute and our anniversary events, please head to our website. And for now, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.